Okay. Oopala. So, hello everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Fields as our first speaker. Chris is currently affiliated with the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University, and he works as an independent scientist and consultant. He has a Master's of Science in Physics, a Master's of Arts, and PhD in Philosophy from University of Colorado. And afterwards, he added a Master of Arts in Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology. In the 90s, he was involved in the Human Genome Sequence project and had joint appointments in industry and academia. His research focuses on applying classical and quantum information theoretic principles in developmental biology, cognitive neuroscience, and fundamental physics. He has also published papers on quantum contextuality and entanglement, and also speculated about the role of quantum theory to explain consciousness. More recently, he has co-authored papers with Don Hoffman, who was a panelist last year, and also with Mike Levine from Tufts. And more recently has also been blending ideas from quantum physics with active inference and Friston's free energy principle, about which he may tell us more today in his talk. All in all, he has more than 200 refereed journal publications in nuclear physics, information physics, biophysics, and cognitive science, information systems, neuroscience, and molecular and developmental biology. So you see the breadth of his interest. You will find more on his webpage, chrisfieldsresearch.com, which I encourage everyone to check out. There's plenty of information. And during COVID, I tuned into one of the sessions of the Active Inference YouTube channel, on which Chris was a panelist, and this is where I first came across his ideas. And during this session, there was a question from another panelist who had a law degree and who, after hearing Chris' talk, wondered about ways to apply these ideas to politics and economics, like in forming a type of quantum politics, quantum markets, and quantum governance. And it was interesting to see that at that time, Chris found this idea very interesting, but from what I gathered from our recent email exchange when we reached out to Chris, apparently in the meantime there has been much more applications in this field. So we are looking forward to hearing more. Also, I should mention that Chris has been a regular attendant and presenter at the Tucson Science and Non-Duality Conference, which is organized by Stuart Hammerhoff. And last but not least, in 2015, he and his wife even wrote a book, published a book on meditation. And so let us now welcome Chris and to his and looking forward for his talk on using quantum theory and the free energy principle to develop non-reductive explanations. So the stage is yours, Chris.
Oh, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Alex, for that introduction of the entire conference. Let me share my screen here, which always involves a little bit of searching. Here. There we go. So I want to talk about how to use quantum theory and the FEP, the free energy principle, to develop non-reductive explanations. And in putting this talk together, I realized that what I'm really going to try to convince you of today is that all sciences are social sciences. And I don't mean that in the kind of sociology of science sense that science is a social activity, although of course science is a social activity. I mean this in a very strong sense that all sciences are, in fact, investigations of communication between free agents in some sort of social setting. So that's a pretty radical claim, and it implies that there's a lot of language learning to do by virtually everybody. And Alex said a few things about quantum theory. Quantum theory is basically a language. And once you understand the language, you can do a lot of things with it. So think of learning this as learning a language. You're not just learning a bunch of computational techniques. In fact, the computational techniques are much less important in my view than an intuitive grasp of what this language is and what it's about. So this being a crazy claim, I wanted to start with an example. This is a paper that some colleagues of mine at Tufts and Michael Evans' lab published earlier this year. And it's about how embryos work together to solve an environmental problem. And the environmental problem is that their environment is toxic. So what Angela and her colleagues did here was expose groups of embryos ranging from 1 up to 100 to a toxic compound that disrupts normal development and finally ends up with some grossly misshapen thing that doesn't survive. These are frog embryos. And she studied how they respond to it. And when you expose one embryo to this stuff, they die. And if you expose a handful, they die. But if you start exposing large numbers of them to the same concentration of this toxin, they start to survive. And that's what's shown here in the lower right. The bottom axis is the number of embryos from 0 to 350. And the vertical axis is percent non-defective. So the percent that look normal. And that line at the top where it kind of tops out is about 80%. So what's going on here? If you expose 100 embryos, that's the blue line, then, or expose a full group of embryos, and the blue line is the number of embryos, but by 100, it's up to 80%. They do really well. They figure out how to solve this problem. If only half of that 100 embryos have been exposed, they do much more poorly. Some of the embryos don't know what the problem is, so they can't really contribute to solving it. What one observes when one then visualizes these embryos is that they're communicating like crazy using calcium signaling, so bioelectric signaling. And if you look at the molecular level, they're expressing lots of genes that wouldn't be expressed normally in frog development. So this group of embryos has somehow figured out how to change their biochemistry to deal with this new environment. How does this work? No one knows. But another interesting question to ask here is, why would you do an experiment like this? Why would you come up with this kind of crazy experiment to look for group problem solving in embryos? And the answer is we've been thinking about biology in this social way for quite a while. And I want to show you why. This is a picture of biological diversity measured by DNA level diversity. And the big fan in the middle is the bacterial world. And that's where almost all the biodiversity in the planet is, among bacteria. And the little kind of purplish fan down at the bottom is the archaea, which look like bacteria, but from a DNA level are much more similar to us. And the little green fan down toward the lower right are the eukaryotes, which are the cells like our cells that have nuclei. And the very tips of those fans are the multicellular animals and plants. And so this diagram raises a big question, which is why multicellularity? And it raises another big question because some of these multicellular things, like us, die if you just leave them alone. You don't actively kill them. You just let them live. They eventually die. And that's a real rarity. Everything else in this picture is effectively immortal. You have to kill it to get it to die. And we also know that in the bacterial world and the archaeal world, there's lots of facultative multicellularity. So the cells will get together and they'll live in a society for a while and have division of labor and all sorts of things like that, or they can live by themselves. And we know that in multicellular systems like us, we have to have lots and lots and lots of bacteria living in us to survive and on us to survive. So this idea of social systems goes really deep, and it in particular is involved in these two questions of multicellularity and death. So what's going on? If we look just at animals, we evolved from unicellular systems. Our unicellular ancestors include amoeba and paramecia and things like that, and most directly a kind of unicell called a choanoflagellate, probably. But about 1 billion years ago, we started to see multicellularity. And after the Cambrian explosion, we got these 6 main lineages of animals. And almost all of them, all except our lineage, are effectively immortal. You only see death in our lineage. So why? What's going on? Well, maintaining a complex body like ours is a big deal, and it requires a lot of division of labor. Both the division of labor between cells that divide, stem cells, and cells that don't, and division of labor in what kind of cell you're going to be if you're not a stem cell. You know, you can be a liver cell or a bone cell or whatever. And those cells need to be made by stem cells. So there's constant communication in the body between tissues needing cells and stem cells that have to make those cells. And the stem cells have to figure out who's going to make what. And in some organisms, the organisms that don't die, there's stem cells around that can make anything. For example, in planaria, which is one of the main organisms that Mike's labs works on, you can cut it up in little pieces and they'll all regenerate a complete planarian. But in animals that die, you see two things very distinctly. One is obligate sex. Animals that die can't regenerate from a little fragment. So if you cut off my index finger, it's not going to grow a new human, whereas in a planarian, that would happen. And the other thing you see in animals that die is cancer. And so we were thinking that cancer and sex may have a common origin. And we think the common origin is defection. That in cancer, we know that it's a disease of defection. Some cells decide that they're not going to be part of the body anymore. They're just going to use it as an apartment house, an environment, and eat as much of it as they need to, and divide as much as they want. But if you think about sex, you have stem cells that have defected from the job of managing and maintaining the body to go live someplace else in a specialized structure, the gonad. And they're the only stem cells that can regenerate a whole body. So this also seems to be a scenario where a band of cells has decided to do something that's not good for the body as a whole. And we wrote a little paper about this. But this illustrates a kind of social thinking in biology that terms like defection are very social terms, and they imply a level of intentionality that it's a little bit unusual to think about at the cellular level, but which I think is there. If you think about the nervous system, you see a similar picture. I mean, in organisms that have neurons, the neurons are telling the other cells what to do, when to divide, when to stop dividing, when to differentiate, in some cases, how to differentiate. So there's a lot of communication going on, and it has a very social function in terms of developing a division of labor and a kind of stratified society that we call a functional body. So Mike has theorized that, in fact, all across biology, at every scale, there's cognition and agency. And in fact, all the way down to the scale of individual molecular networks inside a cell, which can actually be trained and can learn things and have memory and so on. And of course, a lot of people oppose this and think it's crazy and that we're just anthropomorphizing. But in fact, we're not. And here's why. About 20 years ago, Conway, the Conway of the game of life, and Koken, the Koken of the Koken-Specker theorem, which developed the theory of contextuality, which sort of turned into the work of Zafarov and colleagues in quantum cognition, published this paper that they titled the free will theorem, and this second version called the strong free will theorem. And you'll see this is in Notices of the American Mathematical Society. It's a very detailed and pretty challenging paper. But what they show is that under any kind of reasonable definition of what it means to observe something, the observed behavior of a physical system cannot be explained causally, cannot be fully explained causally. And more technically, what they show is that the behavior of a physical system cannot be viewed as determined by everything in its path light cone, which in relativity is everything that can exert some sort of classical information flow or some sort of causal flow toward that object. So they conclude by saying, look, the world simply is non-deterministic. Take it seriously. And they even conclude in their first paper that, yes, electrons have agency. No kidding. Take that seriously. And obviously, science hasn't really caught up to this. But it's a result that depends only on relativity and quantum theory. So it's a deep result that needs to be taken seriously as long as we're going to view those two theories as basically the foundation of our scientific system. So, as I said in the title, what I really want to talk about here is how to put the free energy principle, or the FEP, together with quantum theory, and specifically quantum information theory, which is the way that quantum theory has been formulated now since about the 1990s by people who are working in quantum communication, quantum computing, quantum security, all of those quantum things that are not part of particle physics. And the particle physicists are pretty much in on this act too at this point. And these two allow us to build a scale-free description of communication between free agents. And that's what I'm going to do for you this morning. And scale-free means that the same rules apply at every scale, which implies it's not reductive. It's not about how the behavior of little things explains the behavior of big things. So I want to start by giving you my bias about quantum theory. Alex would probably call me a quantum realist, in that I don't believe the classical information even exists except on boundaries between systems. And you'll see what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. But the main point I want to make about quantum theory is that it's a theory of information exchange. It's not a theory of some microscopic realm where little bitty particles exist. And so quantum theory itself is scale-free. It talks about how systems exchange information. And they exchange information in bits. That's the fundamental quantized unit, the bit of information. And it requires a fundamental quantized unit of action, which means energy times time, to exchange a bit of information. And in fact, Boltzmann had everything he needed to work this stuff out in the 1870s. So we could have had quantum theory 50 years before we did if Boltzmann hadn't committed suicide, because people were so resistant to what he thought. So I'm going to talk about a system, an arbitrary system that I'll always call S, and its environment that I'll always call E, and how they exchange information. And in quantum theory, systems exchange information through the action of an operator called the Hamiltonian, and I'll write that HSE. And the Hamiltonian is the operator that measures energy. If you think of operators as measurement functions, the Hamiltonian measures energy. Its eigenvalues are values of energy. And you'll see that also in a few minutes. So if we reformulate the FEP, the free energy principle, in quantum terms, it becomes a statement about information exchange between generic systems. It was originally formulated by Karl Friston et al. In classical terms, and it is a theory of information exchange between generic classical systems, and making it quantum just increases the range of systems that it applies to. So what's the FEP? The FEP is a very simple principle, and I've stated it up here as a tautology, which Friston describes it as in a paper in 2019. But you can also view it as a definition of what we mean by persistence through time. It just says that a system that persists through time has to maintain its distinction from its environment. That's obvious, right? If it's not distinct from its environment, we can't identify it as a system, so we can't talk about its persistence through time. So this leads us to draw a really simple picture, which is that you have some system, you have some environment, they're interacting by some interaction, a Hamiltonian, and they're distinct from each other, so there's some boundary that separates them. And the interaction is in fact defined on the boundary. And we can ask, what does that tell us about the system? And what does it tell us about the interaction? So that's what we'll investigate. And being physicists, we're going to investigate it by looking first at symmetries. So the first symmetry that you notice when you look at that picture is that if I swap the labels E and S, it doesn't make any difference. So HSE is symmetric. It's an operator where I can exchange S and E without changing the interaction. I've just relabeled things. And this tells us something very important. It tells us that if I'm the system and I'm acting in a way that maintains my boundaries so that I can persist through time, then my environment, which is everything not me, so all of you are part of my environment, and Andromeda Galaxy is part of my environment, et cetera, et cetera. All of my environment is also working to maintain its boundary, which is the boundary that separates it from me. And so it's also an agent under the FEP. It's also obeying this requirement that if it's going to persist, it has to maintain its boundary. And of course, if something happens to me, if my boundary dissolves, then something happens to it too, because now it's a different system. It's absorbed my degrees of freedom. So its identity has changed. So that's what we mean by persistence. The system stays, it keeps its same state space. So the FEP really is universal. If it applies to an animal, it applies to that animal's environment. So let's look at the second symmetry, which follows from the first. If that interaction is symmetric and it's well defined mathematically, then it has certain eigenvalues. There are certain values of energy which are actually being transported across this boundary. And we can think of the boundary as encoding those eigenvalues. And that's actually a principle in physics called the holographic principle, which says that the entropy of any system, so the amount of information about any system that's accessible from outside it, is encoded on its boundary. And so the second symmetry is that encoding is there on the boundary and you can read it from either side because you can swap those two labels. So that tells you that the boundary has a topology, and the topology is discrete, and that each element of that topology encodes a bit, basically, of entropy. And as long as the systems are finite, that boundary has finite dimension. And its dimension is 2 to the n if it has n bits. Its Hilbert space dimension would be 2 to the n. So that tells us something very important also. It tells us that if I'm the system and I'm looking at my boundary, I can get exactly n bits of information about it. And my environment, looking at the boundary, can get exactly n bits of information about me. So there's a symmetry there in how much we can learn about each other. Now we can make this picture very explicit. Since we have this symmetry, we can represent the boundary as a collection of qubits, n of them. A qubit is a quantum bit. So you can think of it as a little spin, a photon with polarization, or an electron with spin in some direction. And we can write down this Hamiltonian now in a very explicit form as a sum of measurement operators. And we can write the measurement operators either from the point of view of S or from the point of view of E. We get the same formula. And we can see, looking at this boundary, exactly what the physical interaction is. E uses its measurement operators to prepare each of these qubits in some state. So it points their spin in some direction, using its definition of what the directions are. And then S measures the orientations of all of those spins, using its definition of what directions are. And in that way, information flows from E to S. And then the cycle reverses. S does all the preparation using its definition of direction. And E does the measurement using its definition of direction. So information flows back and forth, but the fidelity with which it flows back and forth depends on whether S and E agree about, for example, which way is up. And if they disagree, you're going to get what looks like noise, even though there's no other environment here, there's no source of classical randomness or anything like that. You still get this unpredictability. And this is where the, quote, stochastic nature of quantum theory comes from. Disagreements about the directions that constitute the reference frames. So this picture may look very familiar to you, and it has lots and lots of historical antecedents, and here are some of them. This is a picture of information flowing across a boundary that limits the amount of information that flows. And we can trace that back to Hume in the 18th century, his radical empiricist philosophy. This picture underlies the divergence theorem in vector calculus, which is basically the fundamental theorem of vector calculus. It underlies the black box concept in cybernetics that sees someone interacting with an interface without knowing what's behind that interface. It's exactly this picture of statistical picture of the Markov blanket that was developed by Pearl and then used by Friston in the free energy principle. And of course, it's the picture of Hoffman's interface theory of perception from 2015. And all of these rule out a particular stance. They rule out the idea that an observer has kind of a complete objective access to the world. This idea of the God's eye observer, which one finds throughout 19th century physics, and is really the heart of the classical worldview, is that observers are kind of junior gods who can see what's going on. And this picture of information flow across boundaries completely contradicts that. It says every observer has a boundary, every observer has a perspective, every observer has a point of view, a set of reference frames, a set of, if you will, presuppositions, and you have to take those into account. And that's a core message of quantum theory against the worldview of classical theories. And I think these are very important, of course, in any social science. This also rules out the kind of causal theory of representation that Fred Dresky and Jerry Fodor and other people like that in the 60s to 70s to 80s were famous for. it means that your theory of representation has to be inferential. Representations are models. They're not causal results of something in the environment. And the semantics is the semantics that's assigned by the observer. It's not given by the environment. Okay, so what do we get from this? From this way of thinking about the FEP? It tells us that all persistent systems operate in accord with the FEP. I mean, that's just what the FEP says. If you're going to be a persistent system, you have to maintain the integrity of your boundary. All persistent systems have boundaries. All persistent systems have access only to the information encoded on their boundaries. So no system can look through its boundary to see what's going on the other side. It can only see what the other side tells it about itself. And all persistent systems act constantly on their environments. That's what interaction means. So there's no such thing as passive observation, another point that is familiar from social sciences. It's always some sort of inaction. This idea of the observer that doesn't make any difference to what's being observed is classical nonsense. It results from not taking the idea of interaction seriously. So we can summarize this now in the language of active inference that Michael mentioned. And I would encourage any of you to look at the Active Inference Institute website. There are tons of interesting talks and all sorts of discussion and other resources about the free energy principle and the idea of active inference. But active inference is just the idea that systems, and in particular organisms, all the time are doing two things. One, they're learning. They're modifying their own structure in response to what the environment tells them. And the other thing they're doing all the time is acting on their environments in order to make their environment suit their expectations better. And one of the main actions that organisms take, of course, is motion. If I don't like the way things are here, I go somewhere else. Even bacteria do this. So the agent of interest is always doing active inference. It's modifying itself and it's trying to modify its environment. Its environment, of course, is also an agent and it's doing the same thing. So the environment is acting on the agent all the time, trying to get it to change its state. So all interaction at every scale is communication. And so we have to ask, how does this affect the project of explanation? What does this mean for doing science? What does this tell us about this activity that we're engaged in all the time, which in fact is active inference, is in fact learning stuff by doing experiments, which is all that active inference is. So one thing it tells us was recognized by Rob Cummins back in the early 80s. Rob was my dissertation advisor. And he understood by studying psychology that laws of nature, in fact, do not explain anything. Laws of nature are statements of things that we need to explain. So, for example, if we have Newton's third law, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, we have to ask, why is that true? Why does F equals ma? Is there a reason for that? And in fact, we know the reason for that now. Einstein explained it with general relativity, but it took general relativity to understand why F equals ma. We can ask why natural languages have generative grammars. It seems to be a law of nature that natural languages have generative grammars. But that it doesn't tell us anything to just postulate that. We need to explain why it's true. And that's a great question for neuroscience. And in fact, the existence of things like ChatGPT put a pretty strong constraint on the explanation, because ChatGPT doesn't know anything about generative grammar. It can explain what the theoretical construct is, but it doesn't have any programming to do with generative grammar. And we can ask why humans willingly follow the commands of authority figures. Good question for people working on IR or even human psychology or even evolutionary psychology or wolf pack behavior. So again, multiple scales, same question. So let's just to pause and reflect here, look at some of the differences between reductionist explanation, which is often viewed as kind of a bugbear in philosophy of science, and scale-free explanations. In reductionist explanations are the kind of explanations we're used to, the kind of explanations that we get in classical physics, where there are a bunch of laws or some dynamics that describe what little things are doing, and they're supposed to explain the behavior of big things. So this idea of emergence, it goes hand in hand with reduction. So macroscopic objects like organisms are either emergent or they're just epiphenomenal. I mean, it may be that organisms are just epiphenomena, bunches of atoms banging into each other. I mean, you've all heard this story. So societies are just epiphenomena of atoms banging into each other. And there's a fundamental scale, the scale that we call atomic or subatomic or the Planck scale or something like that. Now, I think this whole way of thinking about explanation should just be abandoned. And there is an alternative, which is scale-free explanations. And these are the sorts of explanations that quantum theory very naturally suggests. There are explanations in which little things and big things obey exactly the same rules or have exactly the same formal descriptions. And in particular, I would argue little things and big things both act in accord with the FEP, which is an essentially arbitrarily complicated formalism. I mean, you can go from that picture I showed you of qubits on a boundary deep into quantum computing, quantum communication, quantum gravity, emergent spacetime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very robust and rich formal description that we're claiming that little things and big things have. And macroscopic things are implemented by little things, and they're implemented in a way that enables them to act in exactly the same way the little things are acting, just in a bigger, different environment. So if you think about my cells are living creatures, but they live in a completely different environment than I do. They're surrounded by other cells. Their food is delivered to them every day, every few minutes, actually. And they do their job most of the time, thankfully. But their environment looks nothing like mine. They don't know anything about my environment. They don't know anything about laptops or trees or anything like that. And I don't know anything much about their environment, right? I don't know how to interpret all the molecular signals that they know how to interpret immediately. So we have completely different perceptual systems. We have completely different action capabilities, but we basically obey the same rules. We're both trying to keep our boundaries intact in order to avoid dying. So scale-free explanations are potentially very powerful. And what distinguishes the scale in this case is the density with which information is encoded on the boundary. And that density has an upper limit, at least according to physics. And the upper limit is the Planck scale, which is 10 to the minus 35 meters, about 10 to the 19th GeV. So extremely high energy, extremely small distances. And the only systems in the universe that we know of that encode information at anything like this scale are the boundaries of black holes. Everything else is less energetic and less dense information. But we can roughly divide this picture into two zones. One zone is smaller than 10 to the minus 15th meters, which is about the size of a proton, and more energetic than the binding energy of a proton, which is about a GeV. So above that, this green area is the domain of quantum gravity and high energy physics. I mean, high energy physics only gets a little ways above this scale at places like the Large Hadron Collider. And then black holes get up to the Planck scale in energy. So there's a bunch of this that we can't observe directly, but we can make inferences about. And then above that scale in length or below that scale in energy, we have what we call the macroscopic world. And I've cut it off here at about 1 meter and 10 to the minus 5 EV, which is about radio frequency energy and the wavelength of a radio wave, size of a human being. But we can go to much larger sizes, of course, much lower energy. So we can see things like gravity waves, for example, which encode energy at incredibly low density. And the big middle of this may be empty. We don't know of any physical phenomena that are in there. So this is a picture of coarse graining the way you encode information on a boundary. As you get really high density information, you have extremely high energy. And as you get to lower and lower density information, you have lower and lower energy, but of course, fewer and fewer bits. And this makes complete sense from the point of view of the holographic principle. If you're encoding an energy value, low energies don't require many bits to encode the eigenvalues, and high energies require lots of bits. So that's just this picture. So you're all familiar with this. This is the classical idea that the universe is just some kind of evolution from a bang at the beginning, which is some quantum fluctuation that encodes some information. And the big issue here is where the information is in the fluctuation that specifies everything that's going on now. And no one knows how to answer that question. So this is motivation for looking at a different way to explain things. And so I'll show you the structure of that other kind of explanation. We have some physical thing, which I'll call the environment, and it's evolving through time. And we can measure it in various ways, using different instruments, for example, to modify the resolution of our boundary. So I can look at some small scale, or I can look at some big scale, and come up with a description of what the environment is doing to my boundary at that scale, maybe with a microscope and a telescope. And then I can ask, how do those two encodings relate? How can I map the small scale encoding into the big scale encoding? And so I come up with some sort of theory that does that. I called it T here. And since those descriptions are evolving through time as the environment writes different things on my boundary, that T is evolving through time too. And what we want to do science is that T to be constant. We want to have a relationship between scales that we can talk about and that makes sense. So this is a picture of a non-reductive explanation. This T is a semantic theory. It's a way of relating languages, the small scale language and the large scale language. And this diagram might also look familiar to you if you're familiar with things like the virtual machine concept in computer science or the semantics of programming languages, because this is exactly the kind of diagram that one gets when one tries to understand the relationship between programs at different layers in a virtual machine, which are just descriptions of what the hardware is doing as it evolves through time. And we want those semantic maps to be constant. That means that we understand what the relationship between the programs is. So let's look at biology now. Biology is full of this kind of semantic theory that tells us how one scale embeds in another. So for example, we can talk about how pathways embed in cells, cells and tissues, all the way up to how ecosystems embed in some sort of biosphere. And I want to make a very strong hypothesis here, which is an empirical hypothesis, which is that all of these theories have the same structure, that all of these theories have exactly the same formalism. And in fact, that formalism is given by the FEP as formulated as a communication theory in quantum theory. And this also tells us something important, because we're in this hierarchy. We are organisms. We're in a social niche. We're embedded in a social niche, and we're doing science in a social niche. So we're looking at the other parts of this hierarchy from within the hierarchy. So whatever theory we come up with has to apply to us, and it has to apply in particular to how we observe the world and how we build the theories that we build, whatever computational processes or other kinds of cognitive processes we use. So that claim has consequences that Gödel pointed out back in 1928, that if you have a system and it's describing itself, it can't be both consistent and complete. So we just have to put up with the fact that our science is not going to be both consistent and complete. We have to put up with the fact that there are going to be undecidable problems everywhere in science. And in fact, undecidable problems are everywhere in physics. Here are some of them. One can infer almost trivially that no system can decide based on observations that it's separate from its environment. So I don't actually know that I am conditionally statistically independent from my environment. I don't actually know that I'm an agent. And there's no way for me to find out by observation. It's just an assumption that I make that I'm an agent. No system can decide based on its observation the entanglement structure of its environment. What does entanglement structure mean? It means no system can tell whether its environment consists of separate independent objects. So for all I know, my environment is in one entangled state. My environment is one single quantum system that's just roaming around its state space, changing its phase. I can't actually tell by observation that there are any objects in my environment. So what are objects? I mean, objects are just patterns of statistical correlation that I see on my boundary. And what's on the other side of the boundary, I don't have access to. It may just be a quantum computer. No system can decide about its own internal structure. So I can't observe my own internal structure. All my input is on my boundary, including the input from inside me. So when we think about introspective philosophy, for example, it has no privileged position. We have no privileged access to our own minds. Nick Chater wrote a wonderful book about this called The Mind is Flat back in 2018, which goes through lots and lots of psychological examples of the fact that we don't know what's going on in our own minds. And in fact, we can't know what's going on in our own minds. These all translate Quine's famous no-go results about language sharing, his undecidability of semantic similarity in language use cases from back in the early 60s. So again, these things that one comes to through quantum theory have in fact appeared over and over again in the literature in different guises and arrived to by different means, by different people. So I want to sort of sum up here. The free energy principle is actually a definition of persistence. It tells us what we mean by persistence. Quantum theory tells us what we mean by interaction. Interaction is communication. And these two ideas together challenge us to say how interactions or interacting systems persist through time. And how, the how question, the fundamental question in science, always demands a functional model or a computational model. So we have some states of the world that are evolving. We make some observations. We make a model based on our observations. And the connection between our observations and the world is some semantics that we impose, that we come up with. That semantics is determined by the reference frames that we bring to the table, how we define up when we're measuring all those small spins in the qubits on our boundary. So semantics becomes the key to science, the semantics of communication. And that semantics is a negotiation, always, between systems that have more or less the same point of view. For example, humans that have more or less the same point of view and more or less the same capabilities. And we see those systems at every level in this hierarchy, from molecular pathways up to the biosphere in biology. And we can extend this hierarchy if we want to into non-living systems. The line between non-living systems and living systems is not all that bright, as many papers by Mike Levin argue very persuasively, and I would refer you to those. We can talk about them in the discussion session if you want to. So agents do active inference with their own models. Coalitions arise when agents have similar goals and they aren't direct competitors. And when you have a coalition, you can have a negotiation about semantics. So if this hypothesis about these embedding theories all having basically the same structure is true, we should expect to see the same sort of coalitional structures, the same kinds of social structures and interactions like persuasion and deception and economic exchange and so forth at every level of this hierarchy. And so it should not be surprising that the language of economics, for example, and resource access has become very, very useful in molecular and developmental biology. So I'll summarize just by saying what we're really studying across all of the sciences is communication. And quantum theory is nice because it's a minimal assumption, formal description of communication that applies to any system. And the FEP lets us formulate the processes inside the boundary in a Bayesian language. So in terms of Bayesian satisficing, doing the best job you can with the model you've got. And tying the FEP to a theory of quantum computing is a nice formal exercise that works, and it actually suggests new architectures for things like quantum neural networks. So it's a useful exercise also, hopefully from a technological point of view, not just a theoretical point of view. So my bottom line for you is that the intuitions and concepts developed in social science are actually valuable everywhere. So it's not just a matter of you all learning some physics. It's also a matter of you all teaching social sciences to some physicists and some biologists and other people who are studying complex systems, because they actually need those concepts. And they turn out to be extremely useful. So thank you very much. I'll take questions. I'll also be at the discussion session this afternoon, and hopefully we can talk about this stuff a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So everyone who has questions, please don't type them into the chat, but use the question and answer box, and then we will select. So right now, there's a question by Shmuel Yerushalmi, sorry. So question for Chris. It's a broad question. If you say that all sciences in the world are social sciences, how, according to you, science as math, physics, chemistry, and biology can support solution to problems of poverty, social and economic inequality, and food insecurity?
Oh, I think that's a question that I can't answer. I would love to know the answer to that. As Alex said, most of you are young people, and I think it's going to be your job to figure that out.
Thank you. Katrin Schaffer asks, these are two questions that likely are about clarifying vocabulary. Can you take a moment to address the notion of agent causation? That is, how an agent may spontaneously begin a causal chain. If relevant, can you address whether it makes sense to say agent causation is local, or is it possible that agent causation can be, in a quantum sense, non-local? The latter question is about entanglement in relation to causality, and I'm not sure if it is well posed. Thank you.
It is well posed. And in fact, you can see the free will theorem is trivial. I mean, I said it's a very involved paper to read, and they're very good about laying out their assumptions in great technical detail and working through the argument very carefully. But if you think about a system and you think about its backward facing light cone, so all the stuff that can causally influence what it's doing, and you imagine that that system is entangled in a space-like way. So, for example, it's entangled the way a bell pair would be entangled with something that's distant from it and not in its light cone, then clearly its behavior is going to depend on what that other thing is doing. And that other thing is not causally connected to it because it's not in its backward light cone. It's connected to it in a space-like way. So clearly, entanglement is going to give you effects on behavior that aren't causal. And in fact, you can. What entanglement means is very simple. Entanglement means that the joint state space doesn't factor. It means that the systems don't each have an individual independent state. So if you think about an entangled system, it's a system that can't be cleanly separated into subsystems. The subsystems are not statistically independent of each other. And that's the whole definition. I mean, there's nothing spooky about it at all. It just means that this thing isn't a system that's decomposable. And we tend to think classically that systems are decomposable, but entanglement just tells us they're not. And in fact, most systems are entangled. And the other thing to know about entanglement is that whether a system looks entangled to you depends on how you measure it. And if you pick the right reference frame, a system that looks entangled to me will look disentangled to you. So all of these concepts are reference frame dependent. They're not ontological. They're not objective. It depends on how you look, whether you're going to see things being entangled or not, which is one reason that designing these experiments is hard. It's interesting. Let me go back to your first question. The free will theorem applies to us. So we like to think of ourselves as causal agents that determine what happens around us. And the free will theorem tells us that we can't even determine the behavior of an electron. So we're not determinative agents, even though we're causal agents. Everything we do has effects that ripple outward into our forward-facing light cones forever. And they may be undetectable by observers that are somewhere in our forward-facing light cone, unless that observer is measuring everything about our forward-facing light cone, which means that observer has to be spatially very, very large. But nonetheless, the causal effect is there. And this leads to all kinds of issues when you think about big objects like black holes that have causal effects that propagate out into the universe and are sending signals that stay in entangled states basically forever. So yeah, these are interesting questions about causation, and they almost universally challenge our intuitions about what causation is. So what does it mean to initiate a causal process? I think here again, it's initiate from whose point of view. And if it's from yours, then you think, oh, I did this. Well, you're making a measurement of your own state, and that measurement is necessarily incomplete. If it's someone else, they may be measuring more of your state, and they may say, no, you didn't initiate that. You know, that's a result of all these causal influences on you, up to the fact that you're a free agent, right? Your behavior is not determined by these causal processes that act on you.
Thank you. Next question by Christian Stolne. Thank you. Does the free energy principle apply only to material systems, or may it also be applied to conceptual and non-material systems, for example, cultures and value systems?
This is a question that I would regard as a standard question in computer science. So does the free energy principle apply to a program? And the answer is only if the program is implemented. So only if the program is implemented in some sort of physical system can it do anything. So if I have a culture, I have to implement that culture in some sort of group of organisms, for example, or the culture doesn't do anything. Once I implement it, it does something. And if I implement it, then the free energy principle applies to it. As an abstraction, it isn't a system that's interacting with anything, right? It's just an abstraction. But if I implement it in a physical system, then yes, it's doing something. It's able to interact with its environment, whatever that environment might be, and the free energy principle applies.
Thank you. More general question. How would you suggest the education system needs to be restructured to allow for non-physicists to engage with quantum sciences?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the whole departmental system is archaic. The departmental system is an artifact of the way universities were organized in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then was rigidified and further siloified by the kinds of funding structures that developed in the mid-20th century, especially after World War II. And the system separates people into these compartments that only teach different things, only teach particular things. And I think that's kind of grossly inefficient. So I'm very encouraged by the existence of things like YouTube channels where people present information that anyone can access. It's kind of the encyclopedia model of learning, that you can sample any way you want to, you can learn what you want to, you can follow your nose in terms of what seems significant and interesting. And the internet gives us that freedom in a way that the library gave people before the internet. But libraries are just much harder and more expensive to use. So I would encourage all of you to just learn whatever seems interesting and survive the academic system as best you can.
Thanks, Chris. Kirti Laikala is asking, if a system may change its state during the observation process itself, how can we even assign a state, in quote, function to determine semantics or any computational model? So it's a question about time, I guess.
Yeah. Again, think about a computer, right? You're probably sitting in front of a laptop. That's a complicated physical system that's running on a gigahertz clock. And you're observing it in your stream of consciousness, which has a time scale of about 100 milliseconds. So your stream of consciousness, your observations are running orders of magnitude more slowly than the computer. So what you're doing is making snapshots of the behavior of this system in your environment. And in fact, you're making snapshots at your time scale of your whole environment. And then you're trying to use those snapshots to make comparisons with what you expect to be happening. And based on how those comparisons work out, you're either updating your model of the world or you're deciding to take some action, or both. But your time scale and the time scale of the system you're looking at are, in a sense, decoupled. It's interacting with you at a faster time scale than, in a sense, you're interacting with yourself via your perceptual system. So there are all sorts of events going on in your body that are going at a much faster time scale than your own consciousness. And so faced with that situation, we just do the best we can, right? We make our measurements and we interpolate between them, and we come up with models of systems that depend on state spaces that are the sorts of state spaces that we can measure. We construct state spaces by writing down a bunch of degrees of freedom that we think we understand, and we ask how the system evolves through that state space. And if it turns out that state space isn't good enough, we have to come up with another one. But it's not a process that's given from the beginning. We're just working things out as we go along in this business called cognition or science or whatever you want to call it.
Thank you. And may I inject one question here? So in your model, what is there like a fundamental smallest time scale, and what is it? Or ultimately, if it's scale free, shouldn't it do without any such scale? Or what sets the fundamental time scale?
The fundamental time scale that our physics can deal with is the Planck scale. And that's ridiculously short, 10 to the minus 40 some odd seconds. And that's the scale that's set by our abilities to make measurements. So these units are defined by just taking all the fundamental constants, which are numbers that relate units to each other, and setting them equal to 1. And that gives a spatial and temporal and energy and temperature and so on scale. And if one then takes general relativity seriously as a model of space-time, and one has to do that with a grain of salt because we don't really understand quantum gravity. we in a sense, we understand some constraints on quantum gravity. But if you think in continuous terms, which Einstein's equations are written in continuous space with real numbers and real functions, then as you approach that spatial temporal scale, everything turns into a black hole and you don't get any information out. So you can think of these fundamental physical scales as scales that are setting limits on observation, on scales that are setting limits on the ability of information to traverse what we call space and time. So this question about scale ultimately turns into a question about where space-time comes from. And I'm part of the camp in physics that views space-time as an emergent phenomenon, as something that is actually defined by information exchange. So these questions turn into questions about how fast can systems exchange information through some sort of physically implemented boundary. So they're questions about measurement. So you come full circle back to what can we measure?
So in a sense, it may be conditioned on human perception, or
Um, yeah, in a sense, we can't avoid our science being conditioned on our perception. You know, if you think about, for example, at room temperature, you can calculate with Landauer's principle the amount of energy that it takes to move a bit, right? To move one bit from one state to another. And if you take Planck's constant and divide it by that energy, then you get a time scale. It turns out that time scale is within a few percent of the response time scale of the rhodopsins in your eyes. So these scales really are tied to our implementation in terms of fundamental chemistry.
Thank you. So let's continue with the question. Okay, this is a general question. Oh, so now you can see it. It's about interpretations of quantum mechanics. So I would be happy, it's by Magnus Norberg. I would be happy if you please could elaborate a bit on the impact of different interpretations of quantum physics when it comes to quantum social science. So.
The interpretation of quantum theory has always been driven by the measurement problem, right? The question of what's the quantum to classical transition? Why do we have classical information? Why does the world look classical to us? And so if you look at various interpretations of quantum theory from ignore the problem, basically, which is the textbook interpretation of quantum theory, what's called Copenhagen. I don't think Bohr actually held anything like that as a personal view, or Heisenberg. To something like the multiple worlds interpretation, which is this kind of forward branching tree of possible realities. I don't know why it's not symmetric. I mean, if it's going to be consistent, it should be backward branching too. You should have as many possible paths as you have possible futures. But all of these are based on this idea that the world in some fundamental sense is classical. And we have to explain how this quantum picture connects to the classical picture. And what I've proposed, in a sense, is that we don't view quantum theory in this way as a theory of objects, that we view quantum theory as itself being a theory of measurement, a theory of information exchange. And if you view it that way, then classical information lives in one and only one place. It lives on the boundary. And in fact, it lives on the measurement outcomes obtained by interacting with the boundary. And so if you think this way, then there's no such thing as a classical ontology, right? The only thing that's classical is experience. And there's no classical world out there. It's all quantum. And so how does this affect social sciences? In terms of the mathematics, it doesn't really affect it at all. It affects it in terms of how you think about what you're doing when you open your eyes and interact with the world. And you can think the way that, say, Hameroff and Penrose do, that the world is in some sense essentially geometric, and that your consciousness is a collection of events in the geometry. You can think of it the way that, say, Tegmark does in terms of multiple worlds, that everything you do generates a potentially infinite number of alternative realities, one of which you happen to be experiencing. And of course, you never know which one. And you never know if it might change from one part of this, one path in this huge infinite fan of possibilities to another. So if that makes you kind of dizzy, you can also think of it in this way in which experience is what's classical and nothing else is. So again, it doesn't matter for solving problems, but it does matter for how you think about what you're doing and how you think about what sorts of experiments might be possible. So let me go back to, my very first example. No one would think of doing an experiment like this without thinking of biology in sociological terms. So I think any way of thinking that allows you to expand your conceptual breadth is a good way of thinking to pursue.
Thank you. Alex has raised his hand.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm intrigued by your use of social science language to talk about cells and electrons defecting. You suggested that implies intentionality at the very, very, very microscopic level. And I guess when you think about agency and intentionality and these kinds of concepts at the human level, they all presuppose consciousness or involve consciousness in some way. And I'm wondering, are you willing to sort of say that not in addition to agency and intentionality and everything else, that cells have consciousness too? And is the argument consciousness all the way down, or does it stop at a certain level? Or how do you integrate consciousness into the larger picture that's otherwise immaterial in a physical picture?
I have no problem with consciousness all the way down. And I guess I have no problem with it for sort of the reasons that Galen Strawson outlined in the early 2000s. There's no good place to draw a line. And one doesn't have to talk about human consciousness all the way down. One doesn't have to talk about metacognition all the way down. One only really has to talk about awareness all the way down. And so the question is, awareness of what? Well, an obvious question is whatever's encoded on your boundary is what you're aware of. And I don't see any problem with that. So physicists talk about particles feeling forces inside accelerators, and they use that kind of informal language all the time. So they sound like panpsychists. And for all I know, they all are panpsychists. And I think that's fine. I think we make a bigger deal about consciousness than we ought to. It may be just another aspect of the universe that we just need to live with.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, then Shi Feng has two questions. First question, you mentioned that quantum information exchanges on the boundary between the system and its environment in the sense the system and environment are not separable. But this does not rely on any quantum mechanics, right? For even a classical system, this holds without entanglement. This is the first question. The second, if so, I guess what you mean is there are two distinct notions of separability into quantum and classical.
Well, use this word separability, which is a precisely defined term in quantum theory. Separability just means not entangled. So a separable state is a very rare state that factors perfectly. And so the idea of separability is actually an approximation. And as I said earlier about entanglement, whether a state looks separable depends on how you describe it. So if we're going to state the free energy principle and we're going to talk about a system that persists through time, Karl states it in terms of conditional statistical independence. And if you have two parts of a state space that are conditionally statistically independent, and you represent the state space in terms of a causal network, then you can define a Markov blanket as a boundary that encodes the information that each system can have about the other. And if you translate that into quantum language, a system is conditionally statistically independent from its environment only if it's not entangled with its environment. So only if the joint system, system plus environment, is in a separable state. And as I said, that's description dependent. So whether a system is independent of its environment is an observer or theory dependent thing. It's not a fact. It's not ontological. And when I said that a system can't determine whether it's separable from its environment, that reflects the fact that separability is not ontological. It's description dependent. So we don't, in fact, know that we're separate agents, and we can't know. We assume we're separate agents in order to describe our behavior. So we assume that we're acting under the free energy principle. We assume that we have well-defined boundaries. We can't get outside of the universe and decide. We can't even get outside of the universe and describe ourselves as having boundaries. So we have to do it from inside. And that changes the way we think about what we're doing.
We have time for one more question. Is that right?
Yes, so right now I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, but maybe I could add some. So if you, from what I see, you apply the quantum mechanical framework to your entire description. So, and the way you choose the interactions and also the segmentation or into subject and environment or agent and environment, it's one form of choosing your coordinate frame of your entire. So it's a way so that one can talk about individual agents at all scales and about meaningful exchange, which generates a persistence through time for everyone in the system. But it's just one coordinate frame. So in a sense, you could also rotate it, and then the agents are gone, the meaning is gone, but it's still a valid representation. So what makes is in a sense this breaking of the symmetry towards this one unique coordinate frame, is it built in, or what? How does it come about?
If we adopt our coordinate frame, and so it seems built into us. So let me do a thought experiment with you. Think about your visual system, right? And think about how your visual system identifies objects. So when you're an infant, you learn what an object is because objects are things that can move against a background of some sort. So the dorsal stream in the visual system that detects motion is doing this fundamental segmentation of the environment into objects. And when babies are doing motor babbling, for example, waving their arms around, they're figuring out what the objects are in their environments. You give them toys to play with and so on. They figure out that those are objects. And in our brains, we do this object identification in 50 milliseconds or something. And then the ventral system takes over and it starts to assign properties to the objects like shape and color and all that. And so we see the environment as made up of separate objects that can move independently or be moved independently by us. But those separate objects also have these properties attached to them. And we use the properties to identify the objects. when we're just looking at them. But if we don't look at them for a while, we come back the next day and we see those same objects, we're faced with this question: is this the same thing? And so we have to tell a story about how it might have moved when we weren't looking, or how it might have stayed in the same place while we weren't looking. So now imagine what life would be like if the ventral system didn't take over and we identified objects only on the basis of how they moved. So our idea of what a person was, for example, would completely shift, because every time you went from walking to running, you'd change your identity. So that's a basis rotation from kind of a position basis to a momentum basis in quantum theory, for example. Changes the identities of everything that we call a macroscopic object. So we don't get no semantics, we get a different semantics that's imposed by this other basis that we could choose. And we happen to choose these bases, like the position basis. Early in infancy, we develop that way. But you can certainly think of organisms that develop a different way and use something more like a momentum basis. I sort of suspect my cat's like that. You know, if things aren't moving, it's not interested in them. So I think we have examples around us of systems that work with bases that are unlike the ones we do.